But welcome to our motivation and emotion topic. I'm Nicola Schutte, your lecturer for this topic. We'll have 3 sections. This one, which largely focuses on motivation, the nature of motivation. And the next session will focus mainly on emotion. And then we'll have a 3rd session in which we look at the closely intertwined relationships between motivation and emotion. I think it's quite useful to study motivation and emotion together. They go hand in hand. One supports the other. Also, we have a Zoom session scheduled for next week. That will be after the 3rd lecture. And that discussion, Zoom session, is intended to allow more exchange of ideas, maybe delving a little bit deeper into some of the concepts and applications, as well as perhaps a chance for people to learn more from each other and from each other's ideas. So first, why study motivation and emotion? Why do they matter? They're very, very important in that they give direction to our life and shape how we experience life. So if you think about what you're doing right now, whether you're here in person or whether perhaps later are looking at the recording of this lecture, your motivation and perhaps your emotions played a role in your focusing on this lecture and focusing on motivation and emotion. So you can ask yourself, what led you to engage with this lecture? What motivation? And really, for almost anything you can think about in your daily life, almost any large-scale events you might think of, ranging from how people have dealt with the flooding disasters that we've unfortunately had recently in Australia, to the actions of people in the Ukraine under war conditions. Motivation matters. And also emotions matter. We'll talk about this a little bit more. Emotions fuel our motivation. So for example, if we're fearful, that may induce motivation related to fleeing. For example, gathering, if we unfortunately live in a war zone, gathering our children and trying to escape the danger. So we may be highly motivated to do that because of the fear induced by contemplation of our children, ourselves, perhaps being injured during that war situation. So both everyday events, who you interact with, whether you engage with a lecture, to how you react to a flooding disaster, almost anything that happens in daily life, either at the individual or for that matter at the group level, is related to motivation and emotion. So just as a bit of a further example of that, I thought we could take one activity, people running a race. So take a look at the picture showing people running a race and think about what may have motivated the athletes to train, what may have motivated them during the race, and what emotions might they be experiencing. So before formally covering ideas having to do with motivation and emotion, what ideas come to your mind? What may have motivated the athletes shown in this picture to train as hard as they likely did before entering the race? What ideas come to mind? Yes. Yes. So they may want to win. They may have the goal of winning. And that goal of winning may be associated with various types of needs that give rise to motivation. For example, need for achievement may be related to wanting to win, and that may have motivated them to train very hard. Good. Perhaps a basic need for competency, and we'll talk about that a little bit more, the need to do well in what we engage with, whether it be a sport, an athletic endeavor, a work project, or academic achievement. Need for competency may have motivated some of the athletes. Good. So wanting to win. Do any other ideas having to do with motivation come to mind? Yes. Breaking a record. Yes. Yes. So that may relate to a goal associated with a very specific plan of doing better and better until either a personal record or a national record, for example, is broken. Good. And that can be a strong motivator. Very good. So there may be a group-based motivation, perhaps having to do with relatedness, feeling connected to others, and yes, wanting their group, their family, or nation to have a feeling of pride. Good. That can be a very strong motivation. Yes. Also, motivations, if we go back to the example of warfare, motivation having to do with protect others, family members or people in the nation, it can be strong motivators. Excellent. Looking at the facial expressions of the athletes, can you identify any possible emotions? Oh, pardon. Good. Yes, so an emotion having to do with feeling strength. Good, yes. Any others? Determination. Good, yes. Maybe manifested through some tightening of facial muscles, bit of gritting of teeth. Good. And when we look at emotion specifically, we'll examine how facial expressions are related to emotion and how that's related to other processes, potentially such as social interactions between people. Good. So thank you for those ideas and that analysis. So next, a bit of a set of definitions of motivation. So we've had some good examples of possible motivations, but conceptually, what is it? There are different definitions, and I've picked out two that have to do with motivation coming from the self, and one that has to do with one of our first dissections of motivation, namely approach and avoidance. So here are the three definitions. An internal process that gives direction to our lives. So that's a very basic definition. Another very basic one is that motivation is the process of starting, directing, and maintaining activities. And then one that's a bit more specific and leads into one of our discussion topics for today. Motivation is a force that leads us to approach or avoid. So just as a quick example of that, listening to this lecture, you've chosen to approach that. So that may be related to approach motivation. And we'll go into approach and avoidance ideas in a bit more detail. That very basic set of views of motivation, do those make sense? Then a question that you might think is a bit philosophical, but especially if you take a biological view as well as a sociological view, potentially, it gives us these views gives us some answers to the question of why are we motivated? Why does motivation exist? So here's some basic ideas. Motivation helps us survive, and not just survive, but can help us grow by leading us to approach what may benefit us and avoid what may harm us. So motivation can direct us towards basic survival. For instance, if we didn't have hunger motivation and never ate because of that, we'd likely die. Also, though, motivation encourages the unfolding of our potential. And we'll talk about that a little bit more through the lens of the humanistic approach. So there's evidence that we may be intrinsically motivated to act on abilities that we have, whether they be creative abilities, athletic abilities, social abilities. And as we're motivated to act on those abilities, our potential unfolds. We can become better and stronger in those areas, benefiting not just ourselves, but also often potentially benefiting other people. Also, and this is a bit of a social psychology and perhaps sociological viewpoint relating to why we're motivated, certain motivations, especially having to do with relatedness, facilitate social interactions, and those social interactions, supporting each other, working together with others, collaborating with others in various ways, those allow us to benefit from group living and caring. Those are some ideas regarding why we're motivated. And you'll see that some of the things we'll talk about a bit more tie into these basic ideas regarding why we're motivated. So next, delving a bit deeper into approach and avoidance motivation. So an idea regarding the nature of motivation is that it directs us to approach what may benefit us and avoid what may harm us. Approach motivation prompts us to seek out situations and activities, that is, we go forward towards them, and we tend to anticipate positive outcomes, including, and here's some intertwining of emotion and motivation, including experiencing positive emotions when we engage with those areas. So just as a quick example, if you're thinking about going to a social event and you decide to approach that event, likely you anticipate positive outcomes including feeling happy at the event, feeling satisfied at the event. So approach motivation draws us towards activities and situations, draws us towards other people potentially. Delving a little bit into the biological realm, approach motivation is associated with what's called the behavioral activation system, which is related to sensitivity to rewards, and also is related to positive emotions. So that ties right into approach motivation. Avoidance motivation, the other important motivational dimension. Avoidance motivation prompts us to withdraw from situations and activities, steers us away from situations and activities. We want to flee them or not encounter them in the first place. And at a cognitive level, we anticipate negative outcomes if we encounter these situations and activities, and those negative outcomes include negative emotions. So if you're contemplating going to that social event and you have avoidance motivation, it may be that you anticipate feeling bored, or you anticipate feeling embarrassed at the social event for some reason, or you might anticipate not meeting anyone you can interact with. That may be part of the avoidance motivation that then prompts you not to attend the social event. And avoidance motivation is associated with a different neural system, namely the behavioral inhibition system. And that system is involved with sensitivity to threats, to dangers, either physical dangers, but also dangers, for example, to our self-concept or self-esteem, and is also associated with negative emotions. So again, you can see there an interlocking of motivation and emotion. So let me stop there for just a few seconds and ask you, do these basic motivational dimensions of approach and avoidance make sense? So during our sessions, I thought once in a while we could look at research studies. Some of them will be our own research studies. I thought that might be interesting, because then if you like, you could follow up with a researcher involved with a research team doing the research. And these research examples might also serve as application examples, and we'll also certainly have other application examples, looking at how the concepts that we're discussing, and also how concepts you read about in your text might be applied. So my hope is that, as well as learning the concepts that we discuss and that you read about for the exam, perhaps more importantly, you use these concepts and apply them in your life, in your daily life, but also in career applications and a variety of different ways. So after that brief aside, let me give you this example of a research study, which is an example of drawing on the idea of approach motivation in relation to environmental sustainability. That environmental sustainable behavior has to do with behaviors that we may engage in that help protect the environment, ranging from recycling to reusing materials to trying to reduce usage of fuel and so on. So this is what we found and did in these studies, 2 studies. We found that participants in the study, volunteers in the study, who had greater self-efficacy, and I wanted to use this research example because we'll talk a little bit more about self-efficacy, that is confidence that they could carry out sustainable behaviors, and a greater belief of their ability to change sustainable behavior, had a higher level of approach motivation towards sustainable behavior, and reported more such actual behavior. And I'll show you a figure demonstrating those findings more clearly in a few seconds. But I wanted to also quickly address the second study. In the study, we investigated the effective interventions intended to increase self-efficacy and belief in changeability related to sustainability related purchasing, that is green purchasing. Purchasing items such as recycled bags, for instance. So in this study, we found that both influenced motivation, and the intervention that focused on enhancing self-efficacy, and we'll come back to talking more about self-efficacy in general, had the strongest intention to purchase. So here is that figure that shows the sequence of relationships between self-efficacy and sustainability, leading to approach motivation for sustainability-related behavior, and that then predicted actual sustainability-related behavior. So I know you've already talked a little bit about research methods and statistics, so if that grabbed your attention, then you might be interested in the values. You don't need to know these for a quiz or test, the values, but you might be interested in looking at those and relating those to what you know about statistics and methods. But that was the basic finding for study 1, and I described the results of the intervention study to be a bit of a platform to talk about self-efficacy in just a little while. I wanted to next mention that approach and avoidance motivation is not always as simple as it may seem initially. Oh yes, so some things we approach and some things we avoid. Sometimes that's true, but more often than not, we're faced with many real-life situations that have the capacity to meet or block our needs, and may sometimes have the potential to simultaneously meet several needs, or meet some needs and block other needs or goals. So that can create motivational conflicts. So first, an example of approach avoidance motivation conflict, which can be induced by a situation which we perceive as allowing us to fulfill some needs and blocking us from fulfilling other needs. So, for example, if we're offered a new job, if we're applying for jobs, and we're offered a certain job, and we receive information about it. There may be elements to the job that lead us to approach. Maybe it has a high salary, which is something we want because we're short on funds and things we want to buy. But the working hours are very long indeed, and the work may be very structured. So we might not have much autonomy in the job, and maybe that's something we wish for. And maybe we don't want to work quite that many hours. So we may have an approach avoidance conflict when it comes to accepting that job. Another example of a motivational conflict involves approach. So that can occur when we perceive that two situations, both of which are possibilities for us to approach, allow us to meet certain needs, but they're incompatible with each other. For example, if we go with that job example, we've applied for a number of jobs, and excitingly, we're offered 2 jobs, and both of them seem quite good. Some of you may have encountered this sort of situation, if not in terms of being offered 2 jobs, perhaps 2 social activities that occur at the same time. Which one do you choose? So 2 things you want to do that are incompatible with each other, both have approach elements. So that can induce an approach motivation conflict. And how these sorts of conflicts are resolved depends on how strong the approach is for the 2 possibilities that motivate us to approach. In the case of an approach avoidance motivation conflict, it tends to be the gradient of how strong the approach is and how strong the avoidance gradient is. And then just one last quick motivational conflict type involves avoidance motivation. We think we have to choose between 2 situations, both of which we would prefer not to encounter, both of which we'd like to avoid. So, for example, perhaps we have a painful injury, and we don't want to have that painful injury, and we're told that we have to have a operation. We don't really want to have the operation. So we don't want either one. We don't want to experience the pain, but we also don't want the operation. So again, how that sort of conflict is resolved may depend on the strength of the avoidance push and gradient of the 2 possibilities. Do those conflicts make sense? And can you relate them perhaps to some experiences you've had that may have then induced emotions in you, such as anxiety or stress? So next, a quick general discussion of how motivation arises. And that's a platform for a few of the next concepts we'll cover, as well as concepts that you're reading about in your text. Motivation can come from internal factors as well as external prompting conditions that interact with internal factors. So for example, if you've not eaten for a while, then your body is likely to remind you, to signal that you need food. You may have cravings for food. and that creates motivation to find food. Also, there are external factors, either prompts or stimuli, or sometimes incentives in the environment. An example of that might be that in relation to hunger, even though you weren't feeling hungry, you see a delicious looking pastry, and then all of a sudden you realize that you feel hungry, or you smell something that's very tempting, and all of a sudden you feel hungry.
What about eating food when you're not really hungry?
Yes, yes. That's a very good point, that sometimes we may eat when we're not really hungry, and that can have different reasons. For example, some people, and there are lots of different reasons for doing that, some people may use food as comfort. So if they feel upset or stressed, that may be an internal prompt to eat, because there may be a good feeling, and of course we know from experience of eating that eating certain delicious foods, chocolate for instance, a slice of pizza, may induce a good feeling. So we may use eating as a way of trying to deal with a negative feeling or stress. Yes. Also, sometimes certain habits, such as eating during a certain time of day, and we realize, oh, all right, it's 7 o'clock, it's dinner time, I should eat. So even though your body doesn't signal that you need food, you may respond to that realization that at 7 o'clock, and that prompt may lead to eating. Yeah, so that's a good question, and it may relate to why sometimes people become overweight. There can be other factors too. Yeah, good point. So hunger is an example of a physiological need, and I thought we could cover just briefly physiological needs and psychological needs as motivators. Physiological needs are at least biologically based and inborn, and meeting these needs helps us survive. So some examples are hunger, thirst, when we've been deprived of fluid, drinking. Those two tend to follow a homeostatic model. That is, we try to keep our body in equilibrium. And when we're deprived, our body signals that we're deprived. That motivates us to find food or fluid. And then if we do eat or drink, then that helps us establish equilibrium again. Another example of a physiological need is motivation that comes from sexual urges. That type of motivation is a little bit different. It's pretty good evidence that even though certainly learning plays a role in sexual motivation, that there are also biological underpinnings. And that sexual motivation, which we share with various animal species, has biological underpinnings that may be related to survival of a species. That is, for us, survival of humanity. So if none of our ancestors ever had sexual motivation throughout history, we very likely would not be here. And then a different one again, pain avoidance. These first examples, hunger, thirst, sex-related motivation, tend to result in approach motivation. Pain avoidance, of course, results in avoidance motivation. So that's just a bit of an overview of some physiological needs. Next, psychological needs. And they too, there's evidence from, for example, genetic studies and twin concordance-based studies they too have somewhat of a biological basis. And there's evidence that some psychological needs, which we'll cover in a minute or two, almost all of us share to a certain extent. Though for some of those needs, such as need for autonomy or need for relatedness, are stronger than for other people. But it seems that almost all of us, to some degree, share certain psychological needs. So they're part of our common humanity. And these psychological needs help us adapt and flourish, but they may be somewhat less important for our physical survival, though they can certainly also play a role in physical survival. So examples of psychological needs that have been studied quite extensively, especially through the lens of self-determination theory, are autonomy, competence, and relatedness. So let's look a little bit more at what these involve, and then if you're willing, perhaps you could mention how these might relate to intrinsic motivation in your experience. So first, what are these three basic psychological needs that we seem to all share to some degree? Autonomy is the need to experience choice in initiation and regulation of our own behavior. Even in young children, you can often recognize that need for autonomy. So you may have heard 3 or 4-year-olds say, no, I can do it, let me do it. Does that sound familiar? And of course, as adults, we manifest our need for autonomy somewhat differently in our career choices, in who we interact with, how we structure our time, and so on. And sometimes if our autonomy is suppressed, for example, in the workplace, we might feel alienated and dissatisfied. Competence, basic psychological need for competence, is the need to be effective in our interactions with the environment. So we talked about that need a little bit in relation to the athletes running the race, wanting to do well in what we do. For example, wanting to do well on an assignment, wanting to do well in a work project, wanting to do well in an interaction with another person, perhaps whom we're trying to comfort, wanting to give the help that that person seems to need. So our need for competence to bring about the outcomes we desire can manifest itself in quite a different variety of ways. And then very importantly, relatedness. Basic psychological need for relatedness has to do with our need to establish close emotional bonds and attachments with other people. It may be other individuals, family members, friends, workmates, but it can also be groups. Yes?
Does it have to do with pride and ego?
Pardon?
Does it have anything to do with pride?
It may have to do with pride sometimes, yes. So when we achieve something, we may have a feeling of pride because it's for the group that we feel related to, the in-group, or large group we feel related to, as well as in relation to ourselves. Yeah, good. So those are three basic psychological needs. There might be other psychological needs also, but they haven't been studied quite as intensively. For example, need for stimulation might be a basic psychological need. Now, very importantly, intrinsic motivation Intrinsic motivation occurs when an activity in itself is enjoyable or rewarding. And sometimes satisfaction of the basic psychological needs, as well as being motivating, that is, leading us to approach certain goals or avoid other circumstances or situations. Satisfaction of psychological needs may be intrinsically motivating. So, just as an example, if we're an artist and we're engaged in painting, say that's the art form we engage with, and we feel that it's come out well, we may have a feeling of competence, and that may be intrinsically motivating. But also, it doesn't just have to be fulfillment of the basic psychological need that's associated with intrinsic motivation. It can occur when an activity in itself is enjoyable or rewarding. For example, if you like being in nature, taking a walk in nature may be intrinsically motivating. You want to keep on exploring, or if it's a beautiful day and you like nature, you may be motivated to go out and be in that nature, engage with nature, and that may be rewarding and motivating in and of itself. Or playing a musical instrument that you enjoy may be intrinsically motivating. Or having a philosophical discussion may be intrinsically motivating. Or, hopefully, working on an assignment that interests you, that allows you to expand your thoughts and apply your ideas, may be intrinsically motivating. Let me ask you, one or two of you be willing to share an activity that's intrinsically motivating for you? Yes.
For me, playing domino.
Oh, pardon.
Playing domino. That game.
Yes. Mm-hmm. So that sort of playing, good. Yes, very good. I'll give you one of my own examples. I like taking photographs of scenes that I enjoy and converting those to somewhat different art forms that I think may express an emotion or perception that I had when looking at the scene. So it's just a personal example, and I find that very engaging and intrinsically motivating, just for its own sake, not because of what anyone might say or any external outcome. I wanted to, again, pick up on the idea of applying concepts to research. And this is an example, again, of one of our research studies. I hope I'm not introducing too many of our studies. For all the concepts that we're covering and also you read about in your text, there's so many examples of research and real-world applications that have been written about, programs to help different groups, for example, that could be mentioned. So these are just examples. So in this study, we researched the effect of autonomy support on curiosity and intention to learn. And in this study, the volunteers, the participants in the study, were randomly assigned to either a condition that provided autonomy support. And the way that was done, people in this condition could choose a video with a topic that interests them, or they were assigned to a condition where they were randomly assigned one of the videos without the choice. So they didn't have the autonomy of choice. And people assigned to the autonomy of choice condition showed greater curiosity regarding the topic and wanted to then later learn more about the topic than participants who are not given that autonomy of choice. So that's an example of applying the idea of autonomy and motivation induced by autonomy in a research study. Next, a brief discussion of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. This has to do with how needs that motivate us might relate to each other. And the basic idea in this hierarchy is that more basic needs, when they're not satisfied, are more motivating and are satisfied first. So if we're, for example, very hungry, or if we can't breathe, for example, if we have a bad asthma attack or are submersed in water and can't breathe, that tends to induce such strong motivation that it overshadows other motivation. If we're starving, we may not care so much about motivation that comes from maintaining our self-esteem. We just want to eat so that we don't starve. So in this hierarchy, the suggestion is that physiological needs, when they're not met, induce the strongest motivation. Then come safety needs, wanting to keep us and our family safe and healthy. Love and belongingness needs, which have to do with relatedness needs, having ties with others, intimate relationships, bonds with our family, friends. Then esteem needs, wanting to be able to think well of ourselves. And then possibly self-actualization, fulfilling our potential, building on what we can become, and perhaps our sense of agency, finding our own direction as we unfold that potential. In regard to research on this hierarchy, there is some evidence that yes, if these lower level or deficit needs aren't satisfied, they can indeed induce such strong motivation that it overshadows the other higher level needs. But it's not that the needs occur in motivate in completely separate categories. So under certain circumstances and for some people, the higher level needs may overcome the more basic level or deficit needs. So, for example, sometimes people may risk their life to save others. That is, they're wanting to help others that either they have a close relationship with or that they know need help because of a feeling of connectedness with others generally. They may endanger their life and sadly sometimes be injured as they try to help. So sometimes the higher level needs may overshadow the lower level needs, but oftentimes the deficit needs do induce the strongest motivation, and we attend to those before the higher level needs. Next, a quick discussion of goals. Goals play an important role in motivation. They're an objective we're trying to achieve. So if you like, perhaps write down 2 goals that you have for an application example, or just think of those 2 goals. And then consider how those goals influence your behavior. So if a goal you wrote down has to do with something academic, that goal may influence behavior related to studying, for example, or attending or listening to lectures. Those goals may influence your thoughts. You may contemplate what you can do to help you achieve the goal. And that goal may influence your emotions. So if you think that you're progressing towards achieving your goal, you may feel satisfied, content. Our needs, in part, determine what goals we set ourselves. So if we have strong relatedness needs, that might influence aspects of our goals having to do with what events we attend or who we seek out, with whom we might then have a relationship, career choices having to do with perhaps helping others, if we have strong relatedness needs. Goals are related to outcome expectancies, in that we anticipate that when we reach a goal, we'll experience a desirable outcome. And part of that outcome expectancy may be that we contemplate the emotion we're likely to experience when we reach the goal. And that may fuel our approach motivation towards that goal. A couple of other ideas related to goals. The more specific and concrete a goal, research has found, the more likely we are to reach it. That is, rather than having a vague, undefined goal, if we make the goal very specific and develop a plan for reaching it, we're more likely to reach the goal. Also, very difficult and challenging goals, of course, are more difficult to attain, but they also tend to lead to a higher level of performance. So it's a bit of a balancing. So, for instance, if you set yourself the goal of achieving a credit in a unit, that goal is easier to attain, but you might not do as well as when you set yourself a goal of, saying, achieving a high distinction. But if you set yourself that very high goal of achieving a high distinction, your performance might be better than if you set yourself the goal of achieving a credit. So you might achieve, for instance, a distinction, even if you don't reach the high distinction. So there are certain trade-offs there between likelihood of achieving a goal and the satisfaction that comes from it, and level of performance. Then just a couple of ideas about the self and motivation. The way we see ourselves can motivate us. The real self, how we see ourselves as actually being, can motivate us. So for example, if we perceive ourselves as being a friendly person, we tend to be motivated to act in a friendly way. Our social self, how we present ourselves to others, that can include the social roles we have. For instance, when at work, we may have a certain role. For example, right now I'm in the role of lecturer. In work situations, you may have role of bank teller or therapist, and that can be part of your social self, and that can influence what motivates you. And yes, how you feel when you interact with others, when you engage in behaviors. Our ideal self, how we would like to be in the future, how we would like to be ideally, and that can motivate us very strongly. So if either now or at a later time, you take a minute to write a description of your ideal self, you can contemplate how that ideal motivates you. So it might be an ideal having to do with the physical self, athletic performance, an ideal having to do with interacting with others, an ideal having to do with your occupational self. The ideal self can relate to self-efficacy. Self-efficacy refers to the belief that we can bring about desired and effective outcomes. So it's a cognitive factor associated with motivation. If we have high self-efficacy for a realm, could be mathematics, sport, technical repairs, will tend to be more motivated to enter that realm, engage with that realm, and to persist in that realm. And we build high self-efficacy through doing well in an area, having mastery. We can also build self-efficacy through indirect learning, seeing what others do in the realm. And we can build self-efficacy through encouraging ourselves and having others encourage us, telling us that we can achieve good outcomes. So you might want to contemplate how high self-efficacy influences your motivation in areas of life in which you think you have high self-efficacy, in which you think or know you can bring about good outcomes. So thank you for your good ideas during this session. In the next session, we will talk about emotion and touch on motivation just a little bit in addressing again how motivation and emotion intertwine. So thank you for attending this session, or if you're viewing this recorded session, viewing this session. Bye for now.